Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Columbia SoCal for this evening's workshop, Self-Care in the Age of a Pandemic. I am Emily Lauren Berg, Barnard class of 96, and I'm the president of Columbia SoCal. I do want to let you know that our event tonight is being recorded, and by being here with us, you are giving us consent to record you. We are doing this for your benefit. We often get requests for recordings of events. We will send this out to you at the end so that you can catch it in case you were so busy being blissed out that you didn't hear everything that Dr. Alenkin said. So if you do not wish to be recorded, please excuse yourself now, but we will take your presence as we continue as a consent to be recorded. I would like to let you all know that this program is the product of the community. Dr. Alenkin reached out to us and said that he wanted to share his work with the Columbia alumni community, and I invite you all to do the same. We have programs ongoing throughout the week and month, many of which are submissions of ideas by you all, whether it's yoga or discussing the death penalty or self-care during a pandemic or our weekly social hours and creativity meetups. Everything we do is by the community for the community, so we'd love to hear from you what programming you'd like to see. But without any further ado tonight, because we have a great turnout and we're excited to get started, please let me introduce Dr. Nikola Alenkin, who is a 97 School of Social Work alum and earned his degree from Loma University. And he has taught in many organizations and worked as a social worker around Los Angeles, including the Department of Veteran Affairs, as well as Skid Row Housing Trust. His specialty is an area of service utilization and delivery to homeless populations, as well as national and international poverty issues, veteran populations, secondary stress, and self-care, which is what he's going to be speaking with us about tonight. In addition to sending out the recording, I will also be sharing the slides of the presentation with you all after tonight's program. So if, again, you are too busy relaxing and enjoying and don't take notes, don't worry about that either. So please, Dr. Alenkin, please go ahead. We're really excited to have you here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is truly an honor for me. As Emily mentioned, I am a proud alumni of the Columbia University School of Social Work from 1997. So go Lions, first of all. And thank you to the Southern California Alumni Association for putting this together. This topic is, I think, of even greater importance now, certainly because not only many of us are trying to manage in this pandemic, but we've seen so much in the last few months in terms of issues of social justice, issues of intersectionality, which impact race, which impact gender, gender identity, gender roles, which impact inequities in our society, which have become even clearer, unfortunately, because of this pandemic. But in a way, it allows us an opportunity as social workers, as others in other professions and disciplines, to really, as Columbia alumni, to really be at the forefront of helping those that need the help the most and bringing equity back into the conversation and back into daily life in the United States and truly globally. So I just wanted to say that. I appreciate all of you being here. My information is going to be available at the end of the slides, and they'll be handed out to you, sent to you all. Please, please, I welcome any questions, any comments you might have, anything that I can do to help any one of you. It's my pleasure and honor to be able to help out in this area or any other area. As Emily mentioned, I've been a social worker for 25 years. I've worked in many settings, including Skid Row. I work currently at the Department of Veterans Affairs in a homeless program. I've worked in Twin Towers, LA County Jail. I've worked with Children and Family Services. So I have a broad spectrum of clinical experience. But really my work for the past 10, 11 years has been around the area of stress and specifically coping with stress. And as social workers and those that are working with others, we know that stress is very commonplace, and we see it now even more so. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the presentation here. And as is mentioned, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat area and we will get to those questions. So firstly, self-care in the age of a pandemic. And we're going to look at a few things. We're going to look at the understanding of stressors and how stressors develop, specifically secondary stress, and also known as compassion fatigue. You don't have to be a social worker to experience secondary stress. You could be a caregiver, you can be a nurse, you can be an attorney, you can be someone that's working in what's described now as essential worker. So anytime we come across anyone else in an interaction, in a relationship style setting where we're delivering services or taking services, receiving them, we might be prone to developing stress. And stress is something that we cannot just do away with. It, in fact, is a very important piece of our daily life. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about positive and negative coping strategies. Certainly, many of us are probably very familiar with some of the positive coping strategies, such as exercise, nutrition, etc. But I would suspect that few of us actually carry out those activities that we know are very beneficial to us. In fact, I'll go into some research that I had done at the VA that described how social workers knew all of the things they had to do, but very few of them actually carried out those tasks. And then we'll talk about some of the negative coping that exists, some of the things that we do that aren't beneficial to us, overindulgence, things of that nature, that create a lot of compound effects afterwards. Most importantly, and this is really what's practical from this presentation, is to develop a wellness plan, is to develop a plan of action for you, yourself, that works for you and yourself. And one of the things I want to say up front is one of the things that I have learned in my career and in just the ups and downs of working through stress is please make sure you listen to yourself in terms of what works well for you. I know that may sound contradictory because you have all joined a presentation to hear about my thoughts around wellness and self-care, but truly what works well and best for you, you know yourself. So it's important to try many different things, to take suggestions, to develop a plan, and it's okay to change your plan if things aren't working for you. But what I would recommend and suggest is if you find something that is beneficial to you, continue to do that plan and continue to move forward with that plan, because obviously if it's working for you, then it's beneficial, okay? I'll give you also some practical tips, both for supervisors and those of you that might be working as frontline staff. This presentation focuses on social work, but again, it's really is practical and applicable to most anybody that's engaging with other people in daily life and daily work. So, and then we'll end with some questions. So let's talk about self-care and why it's important. This is very new research, and in the age of the pandemic, we are finding that many frontline healthcare workers are being impacted because of the care that they're providing. So a study in China found that among 1,800 nurses and doctors who were treating COVID-19 patients, 71% themselves reported some level of distress, 50% described depression, 44% had anxiety, and 34% had insomnia. So we can see the real effects of helping and caring for those on the front lines because of this issue. In another study, at University of Rome, researchers surveyed 1,300 healthcare providers, and they found nearly half, so close to 650 of them, reported symptoms of PTSD. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, The symptomology includes hypervigilance, hypersensitivity, intrusive thoughts and images, and things of that nature. So clearly we can see that through this pandemic, those that are working with and providing services to individuals, patients. So it begs the question, what kinds of impacts are we experiencing? Whether we're working directly with individuals, or for many of us who are quarantining or isolating, being told to stay at home, the impacts of that are just beginning to be studied and researched. And there was a recent study that looked at children, for example, and missing time in school, not so much in terms of educational content, but in terms of the socialization aspect. And so they're finding that that socialization piece is really important. So how do we help combat some of that for children? Because it may be difficult, it may present an avenue for some children to become ill if we suddenly open up and have children socialize with one another, disregarding impacts of the virus. And they found very simple things, for example, like virtual play dates, virtual time with other peers, with other children, was very helpful. And in turn, the parents themselves also benefited as well too. So self-care is very critical and important. So social work, unfortunately, there's been only one study that NASW has done in terms of stress. So this is an opportunity for those of you that are researchers and interested in stress to do a survey of social workers. They surveyed 3,600 social workers through the National Association of Social Work. And he found 70% of social workers who worked in healthcare settings described fatigue as a stress-related health concern. 70%, that's a large, disproportionate number. 38% of those who worked in a mental health setting described fatigue also as a stress-related health concern. So we can see that among social workers, this is very impactful. In 2011, I conducted a study within the VA. I surveyed VA mental health professionals, and I found that at least 50% of those social workers and mental health professionals rated their secondary stress symptoms as mild or moderate, and close to 10% rated themselves as high or severe, which meant that the measure that I used was a measure that was also used for the criterion for diagnosing PTSD. So roughly 60% of individuals had mild to severe symptoms of PTSD. What is stress? So this is important because we all need to have an understanding why stress exists and what it is really. And I've broken it down to its simplest terms. There's a lot of research and work done on stress and on identifying stress. The best way to describe stress is any external stimulus or event that we experience as a stressor. And there are good stressors, and there are which are called eustressors, and there are negative stressors. So we have, for example, positive stressors. We might be in a class and we know that there's a final exam coming. And so that might create some stress for us. And in turn, we might study for the exam. Or we have a presentation and we review our presentation and practice it before we give it in front of an audience. So those are some examples of positive stressors. Our body as well, and our mind, has positive eustressors as well too. For example, if we're in a room and the temperature is quite high, our body physiology generates sweat to cool our body down. So eustressors or positive stressors are very important for us. And they, in fact, help us for daily life, for daily living. Negative stressors or distress over time, and we'll look at this model, over time create impacts on our physiology, create impacts on our emotional health, and create impacts on our mental health. So we want to avoid distress or negative stressors. It is difficult to avoid all stress. And I'll say that again. It's very difficult to avoid all stress because stress is around us all the time. And so what we can do is we can try to understand and mitigate stress. We cannot eliminate it. So if someone comes to you and says, here's a book or here's a plan that will eliminate stress, I would take a second look at that, because it's very difficult to eliminate all stressors, because stress is beneficial to us. What happens as we experience stress? There is a biological response that first occurs. There is a hormone that most of you are probably familiar with, which is cortisol, that the body releases, which is the body's way of protecting itself. Our mind, our brain, also releases chemicals to protect itself as well too. Over time, these biological responses can become desensitizing to us, meaning we become less and less impacted by our biological response. And that biological response then starts to impact our emotional response and finally our mental response. The biological response triggers a stress response, which is called the fight, flight, or freeze response. So the parasympathetic nervous system is triggered during the fight, flight, or freeze response. The parasympathetic nervous system is sometimes referred to the autonomic nervous system, meaning we don't have to think about breathing. We just do that naturally. It comes on involuntarily. And this stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze response, also comes on naturally as a result to stressors. As we experience more stress, and it might be immediate stress response, or it might be gradual stress response, we have cumulative effects of this stress. And so that's what's important. How does stress affect us? It affects us through our biological change. As I mentioned, cortisol. It affects us through emotional change. We might start to become desensitized, and we might experience anxiety or depression over time. And then it starts to make changes in our cognitive frameworks, in our thinking patterns, and in our behaviors, which ultimately change our frame of reference or our self-identity. So sometimes you might hear individuals that have long-term stressors may have what's called anxiety disorders, which is the foundations for post-traumatic stress disorders. Anxiety disorders are simply these ongoing changes in our biology, our emotions, and our thought processes that are then become ingrained in terms of our frame of reference of ourselves. And so what happens sometimes is individuals with anxiety disorders can start to create psychosomatic illnesses. So these are, the anxiety produces a physiological response, which creates emotional and cognitive responses, and the body and mind starts to experience distress. The anxious person may have heart palpitations, may have sweating, may feel warm, and all of these things may feel very real because they are real, and they contribute to this continual pattern of feeling anxious. So we want to be aware of these biological, emotional, cognitive changes, and then really in terms of frame of reference. And this is where secondary stress comes in. It's this frame of reference that is very much impacted that I'll talk about. Understanding stress helps us to become aware of environmental cues and changes. And then more so importantly, as we start to mitigate stress, as we start to understand our stressors and how we respond to stressors, we are then becoming cued to the biological, emotional, and cognitive impacts of these stressors. Then therefore we become more aware of our role in helping to manage and mitigate these stressors. So it's very important. The first thing, and we'll talk about this, is understanding your level of stress. And there's a very good assessment that you can take of your current level of stress. And that's really the foundational of where you are in terms of the stress you're experiencing. We have to have a graph in every presentation. So here's my graph. And we have to include some kind of a line, squiggly line going up or down. So here it is. So why am I referencing work from the 1930s? Because simply this is the easiest way to understand what happens over time when we experience stress. So Hans Seeley was studying stress and responses to stress. He specifically looked at the physiological responses to stressors, and he identified 3 phases: the alarm phase, which is the beginning phase of stress, the resistance phase, which is a plateau or cumulative stressors, and then over time, the exhaustion phase. So if we look at this graphic, When we experience stressors, our body responds, we develop biological response, we develop emotional response, we develop cognitive responses, and over time we become desensitized to that because our body and our mind starts to manage some of these stressors, even if we're aware of it or not. Over time, our mind and our body go into an exhausted phase. So some of you might be working in environments, or you might have this experience where you may not necessarily be in a work environment that is labor intensive. And you might come home at the end of the week or do a week's work and feel exhausted. Well, how did this happen? I didn't do any physical work. How am I so exhausted? Well, over time, this resistance to the mental strain that you experience creates exhaustion. So it's very important to know also in which phase that we're in. Most of us typically are in a resistance phase because most of us may not be aware or cued into our stressor responses. And so we may not be aware of changes that are happening biologically, emotionally, or cognitively. And then we become aware of it, becomes clearer to us, and we become aware of it in the exhaustion phase. And by that point, it's kind of a little too late to try to do mitigating responses. We want to do those earlier on. In fact, we want to do those in the alarm phase. That's why we want to have an understanding of where we are in terms of foundational stress in our life and the biological, emotional, and cognitive areas. So some of the stress constructs, this is important so that you understand how we have gotten to what's called secondary stress. So countertransference, some of you may be familiar with that, those of you that work with clients or consumers. Countertransference was coined by Sigmund Freud, late 1800s, early 1900s. It's an emotional reaction to a client as a result of a counselor's personal life experience. So we experience this transitory feeling of something may not be right here. And if we have that intuition of something may not be right, of where we feel the consumer or us, maybe we are overextending ourselves, or the consumer themselves is overextending on us, where boundaries might be enmeshed or things of that nature, we're experiencing countertransference. Burnout, most of you are probably familiar with burnout. This is emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal feelings of reduced personal accomplishment. Most of us experience burnout many times. We experience this sense of things aren't going too well. I need to kind of take a break and get back and recharge and refocus. Vicarious trauma was the first construct that started to look at this frame of reference. And the vicarious trauma research was done by clinicians that were working with survivors of sexual trauma who themselves were also survivors of sexual trauma. And it wasn't just countertransference or burnout. These clinicians were experiencing very deep changes in terms of their cognitive frameworks, their frame of reference, their self-identity. From this work came compassion fatigue and secondary stress. Compassion fatigue and secondary stress was developed by Figley, and it is basically the development of PTSD symptomology from the hearing of or experiencing of someone else's trauma. Okay? So there are three domains of symptoms. The experiencing of the primary survivor's traumatic event. This can be something that we hear or witness. And so we ourselves have intrusive thoughts or images when someone is sharing with us their traumatic experience. Avoidance of reminders or numbing in response to reminders. So this could be we over time develop this desensitization or this avoidance of even working with individuals who have trauma or have shared trauma with us, or even ourselves being desensitized to traumatic experiences over time. And then persistent arousal or hypervigilance, this feeling of always being on guard. If any of you have worked with survivors of trauma, they often describe having to, quote unquote, look over their shoulders or feeling on guard many times. And this is what the individual themselves experiences in secondary stress. So how do we know if our stress has gone from the plateau or resistance phase to the exhaustion phase, and how and when do we need to start working on ourselves and integrating self-care? Here are some red flags. A lot of these, many of you may have, and this is just a brief list of some of the physical reactions, which might be fatigue. That's very high on the list, is individuals feeling tired or fatigued all the time. Sleep disturbances, that can also include intrusive images or thoughts of the traumatic event. Upset stomach or gastrointestinal concerns or issues, and chronic muscle tension. Sometimes you'll see people walking around with their shoulders like this, always hunched all the time. That's chronic muscle tension. Emotional reactions, feeling overwhelmed or emotionally spent, mood swings, a feeling or sense of helplessness or irritability. And then behavioral reactions, isolation or withdrawal, restlessness, overconsumption is very much common, food or alcohol. And then cognitive reactions, disbelief or sense of numbing, decreased concentration, or distressing or intrusive images. So all of these are red flags in these 4 areas that we can be experiencing that are saying to us, we need to do something about our stress. And it may often get to the point of exhaustion before we really begin to understand that. So it's important not only to have the foundational of where you are in terms of stressors, but where are you in terms of your reactions to stress. And sometimes it's helpful for people to keep a log of the physical, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive reactions that they're having so that they can better identify for themselves these reactions. All right. How does secondary stress develop? So Figley developed a model for stress that talks about exposure to the client's story or experience, or it can be someone else. We might hear someone that is a loved one or a friend tell us about a traumatic experience. That could itself be enough. The level of satisfaction that we have in our work is seen to be a mitigator of secondary stress and stress in general. So the higher we feel satisfaction in terms of the work we do, the more we enjoy our work, the less we are likely to have that stress impact us. So that's why it's very important for organizations to create self-care within their organizational models and to help individuals practice self-care within those models. And then the self-care of the worker. So I'm going to bring up this PowerPoint that I have here. This slide is kind of has animation here. So here's the worker and the client or consumer, or this could be you and someone that is telling you a traumatic experience or story. And then we have this exposure. And then what happens is there's a response. So we might be very intently listening to the story that someone's telling us about their traumatic event or to the client or consumer we work with, and we don't really think much of it. But then later on, we might have intrusive thoughts or images about the story that was shared with us. And we might begin to question or think about what these responses might mean. And our work then begins to be impacted by that. Our sense of satisfaction, as I said, is a mitigator. So these 3 areas are important. And what happens is when we detach, when we practice self-care, we allow ourselves to reduce the exposure to the client, to reduce our own internal responses that might be negative, and to increase our sense of satisfaction or worth of the work that we do. Prolonged traumatic exposure creates this secondary traumatic stress. And the more prolonged exposure that we have, the greater the secondary traumatic stress becomes. And so the way in which we cope with that is by having more self-care, integrating more self-care. So let's talk a little bit about coping and what coping is and how we can start to develop coping strategies and skills. Coping is cognitive and behavioral efforts aimed at managing stress, psychological stress. Coping helps us mitigate the impacts of stressors and stress and helps bring normalcy or a level of plateau, or going back to the phase of Hans Seeley, the second phase of resistance. Really, we want to have that as a way to detach from our work, from the stressful events. So coping, and these are aspects for clinicians and workers. This is called the CE CERT model. There are 5 aspects. I'm not going to go through these. I will send along the article that describes these. But in a nutshell, when we begin to create coping strategies, throughout our work, we begin to engage with our colleagues and our peers. We start to think through and reduce ruminating thoughts and intrusive images. We start to develop a positive, conscious narrative about our work and our clients. And then we reduce emotional labor. We try to reduce the distress that we encounter. This can be by reducing our workload of traumatic clients that we work with, or by increasing our detachment from our work by taking time off. And this can be as simple as taking a 15-minute break between seeing someone that you're working with. And then, as I mentioned, the parasympathetic nervous system, which gets activated in stress, can also be strengthened through breathing, meditation, yoga, exercise, etc. So we allow these 5 aspects to help increase our positive coping strategies. Coping is effective when we identify the stress, and as I mentioned earlier, we want to do things that are beneficial to us. So things that are working, we want to continue to do those things. And it's a practice of trial and error. Sometimes we might be trying a new practice, and it may take a few weeks or months to integrate that practice, but we want to continue if it's beneficial. Someone might suggest another practice to us, and we might try that practice, and it may not be so beneficial. So that we know it's time for us to return back to what was helpful for us. So the key takeaway from this is, when you find something that's effective for you, continue to build on what's effective for you. That's the best kind of medicine that we can give, is try to avoid things that others say that are helpful to them. Try them out, but see what's beneficial for you. When we expand our resources to mitigate stress, along with prevention of new stressors, and that's created by developing a wellness plan and integrating that wellness plan, and by doing that wellness plan daily. So what is effective? Talking about the impacts of stress. For example, participating in this presentation and sharing this information with others is beneficial. And then talking about your own stress when your levels of stress are very high, talking with others when your levels of stress have plateaued or are decreasing, continuing to talk to others about the good, positive coping strategies that you're using. Understanding the demands of your work. We're going to talk about role and how role is very key. If you're in a work environment and you're unclear of the role that you have, it's very paramount to ask for clarification of roles, because that's where we most experience stressors, when we become overwhelmed with role strain and or role conflict. So it's very important to self-advocate, to really demand that we understand what our roles are. And if your superiors are unwilling to do that, you may want to look at the organizational environment you work in and whether that's a beneficial work environment to be in. Now, we have to balance the practical sense of work with the demands of work. And so that's a personal choice. But oftentimes in organizations where we find there are overwhelming or conflicting roles, we find high levels of stress. So that's important. Utilizing effective means, again, find things that are helpful for you. And there are many different practices that have been shown to be helpful, but find what works for you. Helping organizations become aware of the impacts, talking about stress and its impacts in the environments you work in is very important. And then fundamentally, taking time, scheduling 15 to 30 minutes of your day, every day for time, is important to talk about stress and to talk about mitigation of stress through stress strategies and stress coping. So let's get on to a wellness plan. Number 1, recognizing what stress is. This is a very simple, useful scale, the professional quality of life scale. It looks at different areas of your life, both personal and professional. And you have the link here, and you can download this or simply Google professional quality of life scale. It's completely free. And they offer the scoring mechanism so that you can score where you are in terms of your levels of stress. This is a helpful foundational place to begin. Where are you most experiencing stress? Is it personal life or is it professional life? That's where you can start to then develop a wellness plan to help start to mitigate some of the aspects of stress. So begin here. Doing the wellness plan is not helpful unless we understand what our current stressors are. And you want to do the stress where you are in terms of the stress scale, the professional quality of life scale, quite frequently, once a month, maybe every 2 weeks, so that you understand and know where you are exactly in terms of your level of stress. And so you can track whether there's an ebb and flow and what you've been doing in terms of that current cycle of time that's perhaps added to your heightened stress or help you to reduce your stress. Second, make changes. Here's a very simple wellness worksheet that's very easy to use. And it starts, you can start by listing different aspects, diet, nutrition, exercise, peer support, talking to colleagues, attending educational events, et cetera, that help you to mitigate your stress. There is a wellness plan for you. And we, again, always can change these areas of what we look at and impacts of wellness and wellness tools that we use. And that's also equally important for us, not only to measure the stressors, but to also look at how well our wellness plan is being integrated. Third, ongoing dialogue, just like we're doing here with colleagues and peers, with subordinates, and with families and friends. One of the things that's been shown to be very helpful has been the mitigation of stress, has been talking to peers and colleagues, whether that's in the workplace or with family members. One of the things that they look at in terms of how people maintain exercise and a diet plan is whether they've discussed that diet plan and exercise plan with others and whether they've joined in with others in terms of an exercise or diet plan. So in the age of a pandemic, where most of us are virtual now, you can set up a virtual meeting with your friend, your loved one, and exercise with them, or have a 30-minute chat with them, or a 15-minute chat, or start a book club, something that's ongoing dialogue for you that's helpful. All right, for frontline staff, this is, again, doesn't have to necessarily be for social workers, it can be for others that are working in really any service profession where you come across other individuals. So understanding the role is very important, and the role of your job, and also the role of stress within your current job. How much stress is there, and what is within your control, and what is outside of your control? One of the things that you can certainly do that's within your control is when you experience stress is taking a break. Sounds simple, but it's very important. Always take the opportunity to consult, whether with peers or colleagues, or to interact with supervisors. This is really key time for you to talk about and look at your role, and to talk about and look at how you are integrating your wellness plan in terms of your workplace or your personal life. So it's an opportunity to talk about your stresses and your successes at the same time. We've talked about role. Again, be consistent and structured, ask and seek clarification. Be aware of issues related to ethics and boundaries, and review those if there are issues of ethics and boundaries, because this is also one of the first areas in which we experience stress, is when we have enmeshed boundaries or we have ethical dilemmas that we have difficulties in. Very importantly, create an environment of wellness within your workplace and home environment. Some of you may have noticed I have some plants in my office. May seem very simple, but even small little touches like that are very important. In your home, create an environment that's welcoming and that provides wellness. Having photos that are uplifting, having motivational sayings, having things of that nature within your home, within your office, within your virtual office are very helpful. For supervisors, those of you that supervise others, again, this article will be available for you. It's very important in your meeting with others, subordinates or others, that you're very clear, and this is kind of a 5-item how you can set up your meetings with subordinates or even with coworkers, and I go through this with individuals that I supervise, I always review roles and expectations at the beginning of each meeting so that my subordinates, those that I supervise, know that that's important for me and it should be important for them. Confidentiality is very important. We're not talking just about confidentiality for clients or consumers, but creating an environment where a subordinate or someone you work with can confide in you. Confidentiality means confiding in someone. So creating that environment where someone can share, and it's important for the supervisor to role model and confide with their workers, personal experiences, barriers that they come across, whether it's in the workplace or even self-disclosure in terms of personal life, are important in developing confidentiality. Frequency of meetings are very important. Obviously, the more consistent and frequent the meetings, the more of an opportunity we have to look at individual stress levels and to talk about stress levels and to help people mitigate those stress levels. Conflict resolution is included in the meeting time that I have with my subordinates. That's an opportunity for them to talk about any difficulties they've had in the work and for us to brainstorm strategies around conflict. And then finally, I always end with goal setting. What are the action steps for the next meeting? And what are action steps that they can take tomorrow or right after the meeting that'll help them to continue reducing and mitigating stress that they have? So this would be helpful for those of you that are working with individuals. Here's some more tips. The CE CERT model, I will send that out. Role modeling wellness is very key. I always take time out, and I'm very clear with my subordinates why I'm taking time out, because I want to role model to them that it's important to take a break and for them to have a time out as well too. Recognizing stress and avoiding burnout. As we talked about earlier, the foundational levels of this, knowing where you are in terms of your stress and looking at the phases of stress that you're in and mitigating the stresses earlier on. Talking with subordinates and peers in terms of signs and symptoms of stressors from your first meetings. And then again, creating agendas and setting the agenda for meeting with subordinates. So with that, this is my contact info. I'm welcome to take questions from any of you that are here online, and you're welcome to contact me if you need in the future as well too. So I'll hand it back to Emily.
Thank you so much. Oh, there we go. Sorry, my video's not cooperating, but I promise I'm here. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Alenkin. We will take questions in the chat box if anybody wants to submit anything. That was so helpful and informative and interesting. I mean, I know I have one question. You were very agnostic in terms of saying that try something that works for you, and if it doesn't work for you, don't do it. But we so often hear yoga, meditation, take a walk. I was a yoga and meditation teacher for a long time, and people always said to me, oh, I know I should do yoga, I know I should meditate, but it doesn't work for me. I think for a lot of people, they could get really stressed out feeling like they have to find something to help them manage their stress.
Exactly.
So is there something that you can suggest to people to help them manage their stress around managing their stress?
Yes, that's a great question. So, and that's a great example. I practice yoga myself, and it's taken me some time to get into an integrative practice, meaning that I do that almost every day. And one of my favorite teachers, she's free on YouTube. Her name is Adrienne, Yoga with Adrienne. Some of you may have heard of her. And I started off very much doing just very basic 5-minute yoga. And to be quite honest, that was very difficult in the beginning, just to do 5 minutes. And as you said, for some people, it's almost like an obsession because it doesn't work for them. They don't see results right away. And so they start to do something else. So what I mean by doing something that works for you and sticking to that is after some time, after about 2 weeks, I went from 5 minutes to 30 minutes to 40 minutes. And at some point I felt that it was too much. I was getting burnt out on doing yoga every day. So I transitioned to walking. So what I mean by finding something that's helpful is it's okay to every once in a while shift and try something new. But when you find something that's helpful for you, for example, yoga is very beneficial for me because it helps me to focus and concentrate on my breathing, which I know for myself, when I have anxiety and feel anxious, my breathing becomes very shallow. So I'm very in tune to my breathing. So when I know that my anxiety levels are going up, I go back to the simple practices of yoga. So I don't start right away with 30 minutes. I might do 5 or 10 minutes. So I think being understanding of what works for you means it's okay to try different things, but when you find something that's beneficial, stick with that. Don't get overly, one of the things that our mind loves to do is our mind loves to imagine. So we love to imagine ourselves running a marathon with only 2 weeks of training. Mm-hmm. So we get out on the track and we start running. Every day we're going to run for an hour to do this marathon. And our body says, that's not happening. Our mind is telling us you can do this, but our body is telling us that's not happening. So we want to be in tune to our body and our mind. So when we start a new practice, we want to really be focused and concentrating on that practice to see what are the impacts that we have. And sometimes that takes time. So what I suggest to people is try something for about 2 weeks. And if you're seeing a benefit, continue with that. But if you're seeing that you're getting to a point, because our mind and body also reach a plateau, if you're reaching a plateau where it's not as beneficial as it used to be, try something else for a little bit and then come back to that practice. But don't think that you're going to be running a marathon in 2 weeks without training for it, because your body is going to stop. And your mind might tell you you can do this, but your body will stop certainly before your mind will tell you that. So it's very important to focus on aspects of wellness that are truly beneficial for you. There is no magic bullet. There is no try this out for 10 days. There is no I did this and it'll work for you. The takeaway message is try to develop a plan that for yourself fits into your lifestyle, is something you can do that's integrative. Integrative means we do it on a daily basis. So I might not necessarily do yoga every day, but I can certainly take a 10-minute walk. And that's something that I know is beneficial for me. So I stick with that. I do every day at least 10 minutes of walking. Sometimes I do more, but at the minimum I do 10 minutes. And that's become an integrative practice for myself.
That's so nice to hear, because I think the standard is, you have to do something for 30 days for it to become a habit. And that's a pretty high bar. So it's nice to hear, just try over 2 weeks. If it doesn't work, try something else. That's a lot more space around that. It feels much more manageable.
Certainly our mind becomes adapted after 2 weeks. So we develop, and I'm not a physiologist or kinesiologist, but this is my own personal experience. When I try something for a few weeks, my body becomes more adaptive to it. And I, within myself, know what my limit is. I can't run a marathon anymore. I used to, but I can't do that anymore because my body breaks down too quickly. But I can certainly walk, and I do that and I integrate that. So do things that are, the key is do things that are integrative for you. Again, integrative means it's part of your daily life. Find those things. It might be 5 minutes of walking and 5 minutes of yoga. It might be 30 minutes of walking and 20 minutes of yoga. Some people have a benefit from, for example, of going to the gym and working out in a gym environment, right? Some people find benefit from watching someone on a video and doing the workout with the person in the video. So whatever works for you is what's beneficial.
Well, and if you or anybody here wants to practice yoga with us, we have our monthly mid-morning ritual mindful yoga reset. It's gentle yoga and meditation. We have it the first of every month. It's going to be on Monday, the 3rd this month, from 12 to 12:45, where one of our alums comes and teaches yoga to our community. So I'll put in a plug for that in the spirit of our discussion. We hope that you'll come and join us. Are there any other questions? I know Laura C., if you're still here, you had submitted something to the chat box. Would you like to address it directly? I will unmute you if you would. Let's experiment with this. Okay. Oh, here we go.
There I go.
Hi,
Hi.
Laura.
Hi. Well, I asked a specific question, but it's actually, I can broaden it, which is that I'm trying to figure out what to do about a situation that doesn't have much of a solution. And in my case, I have a 101-year-old mother who lives in New York who wants me to come to her, and I'm in California. And it's a difficult time. And in fact, I'm at risk myself. So what do you do when you have a situation that is not going to be resolved soon or satisfactorily for anybody?
That's a very philosophical question. Very existentialist question. How do we resolve an issue, right? And certainly what you said at the end, something that may not resolve perhaps on its own or to the expectation of the people involved, right? So firstly, amazing, your mother being 101, that's something to celebrate. I would celebrate that, first of all. And I would also celebrate an opportunity for you to try to develop a relationship, perhaps in a way that's virtual. And I know that's very difficult. I can understand having older adult parents myself. You know, we want to be there for them, and sometimes it can be quite difficult. So I think celebrating the small things, for example, if you have an opportunity, do you have an opportunity to connect virtually to her, or is that not possible?
Oh, well, we do connect as much as possible, but she's also deaf and blind, getting blind. So, I mean, lots of people, though, these days have this issue where you can't get together, or, you know, and there's urgency in the situation. And it's just, you know, it's a difficult thing to try to make yourself not feel guilty about. I mean, I think I'm more at risk in many ways than she is at this moment. And so, but she does, you know, she's 101, so she has an immediacy.
Right.
That's the issue that you know, they're balancing, other people have a sense of their own immediate needs.
Right.
Not necessarily the caretaker or the caregiver's immediate needs.
Yeah. I'm a caregiver myself, and I can tell you there's a very fine line between giving care and caring for ourselves. And I think that fine line is what we have to try to balance. I think you're identifying the need for you to obviously have a connection with your mother. And unfortunately now, during this current time, the difficulty in doing that. And I think just by talking about it, you presenting it here is one thing, but in talking through perhaps in a way with your mother, it may not make the most sense to her, because I could see how the immediacy is important. But in just having the dialogue, I think there would be a way to develop a fruitful compromise. You know, that's the best word that I think we can come up with, is how can we compromise your needs with the needs of others? And, you know, one of the things that's very essential in the human spirit is the connection that we have, particularly with our loved ones. And these times are very difficult for many, many people. And I think what I can say is celebrating those small moments, even if they may not be what your expectation may be, or perhaps her expectation. And just by having that dialogue around it, creating feelings and allowing feelings to be open, to discuss, hey, you know, I'm a little scared. If I come out, I might be at risk, and I don't want to put you at risk, although I miss you. The word that you used, feeling guilty, I think that's an important word to have a conversation around. And that these feelings can be identified, and those feelings are really what help to create the human relationships that we have. It's a difficult spot, Laura. So I think what you're doing and working through it and thinking through it in a way that comes to some compromise is the best thing to do. You know,
that's helpful, and it's also nice. It's nice to have someone sound forgiving about it as opposed to accusing.
Well, being a caregiver myself, I've been on both ends of the spectrum. How's that?
Okay.
A great question.
I'm Will Nettleship, so if you can hear me, I'd like to just bring up a few things here.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
My wife and I are in our 70s. I mean, we're at least in theory retired. I'm an artist, and I've been used to working at home most of my life, actually. And my wife is a retired professor, and she's working at home too. I think this is, a reasonable situation, but I don't think before the lockdown happened that either one of us really realized how much it mattered to have whatever social life we had, to be able to get out and go to concerts, to be able to see friends. I mean, I'm digitally challenged, shall we say, and I'm working on it. I mean, I'm trying to get the best I can out of going to Zoom meetings and that sort of thing. And I'm grateful that I'm certainly saving a lot of gasoline, but it's not the same thing. I mean, it doesn't have the vitality, of actually seeing somebody or shaking their hand or giving them a hug or, just sharing a glass of wine with somebody or any of those things. So, a lot of what you're talking about is from a professional point of view. And I mean, I'm not really asking a question from a professional point of view, but I'd be curious to know what you think about ordinary civilians, so to speak, who find themselves under a lot of very unaccustomed stress right now. So that's
Excellent.
my basic question here. So
Excellent. Emily and Courtney, I think we should have called this the Jean-Paul Sartre presentation, because we're getting a lot of existentialist questions, which are great.
I appreciate that people feel so comfortable to open up, and I appreciate that you're so willing to be in dialogue with them. And if it's okay with you that people just bring their questions directly, I'll get out of the way.
Sure.
And if people feel comfortable turning their cameras on as well as they speak, I invite them to do that. But please go ahead.
Sure. So, Mr. Nettleship, firstly, I want to thank you. You're doing excellent. You're actually doing a lot better than many folks in terms of the technology adaptation. So kudos there. But again, I think this presentation, although quote unquote, it's was geared towards professionals, I think the idea of self-care, and again, this is very connected to what Laura was saying earlier. The human psyche and human spirit relies on human connection and human relationships. And being an artist, I'm sure you can appreciate that. Art gives us, the expression of art gives us the opportunity to connect to our psyche, our soul, what's really within us as human beings. And it's wonderful to have art and to have artists to demonstrate to us how resilient our human psyche can be. And so I'm right there with you, as I'm sure many of the people are on this, that the past few months have been a tremendous, tremendous strain on the human psyche. And it certainly is not the same as it was once before. I even find myself being very nostalgic at times, looking at photos, reminiscing about events that I was going to, and having a longing and an imagination at being at those events again, which we will very soon. I'm very hopeful. I think another piece of our human psyche is hope, along with resiliency, and we're very hopeful animals. And I think what really we're being burdened with right now, this self-expression and self-isolation is really, again, bringing us, many of us, all of us, humanity, to a better understanding of a lot of the inequities and to really the prioritization in our lives of truly, truly what is most important. And I would say, Mr. Nettleship, the important part here is continue to do your art, and in a way, if you can, to express some of those connections. It is not the same, but I think that when we express ourselves, whether it's through art, music, or just in dialogue, having this dialogue is an expression of our psyche. I think those things are what will help to sustain us. And I think that's what gives us hope, many of us hope, and resiliency. You know, the famous song, "The Sun Will Come Out Tomorrow." I think there's a lot of hope in that. And I think that's, whether we're professionals or civilians, I'll count myself in the civilian pile as well too. It's important to have that, to have this longing and spirit. And I think that's what will maintain us. So that's an existential response to an existential question. How's that?
I thought it was gorgeous. So I really appreciate it. I know we have a question up from Greg. I'm going to unmute you. I'll also turn on your camera, Greg.
Sorry, that's actually my husband's account.
Oh, hi.
My name's Soraya. Hi.
Hi, Soraya.
So kind of a semi-related but two-part question. Kind of how and where do you draw the line between the healthy version of a coping mechanism and so it becomes unhealthy? I think the easiest example for me is food. You know, that you can use food as a really healthy coping mechanism and, you know, do healthy diet changes, or you can make a whole cheesecake and then get depressed and then eat all of it in one sitting, and then it becomes unhealthy. So kind of that part of it, and kind of related to that, when you use conversation, like you were talking about, being able to de-stress with others and having the conversation with other people about your stress. And I just sometimes find that the only people available to me to talk about things with are sometimes people who are not in the field. And then I feel like I have the secondary stress, and then I'm giving them tertiary stress because they have a lower tolerance for it, or they're not used to kind of that general baseline level of stress that comes in that. But my need to talk about it versus like the need for them to not hear about it, and kind of where that balance goes.
Excellent question. Excellent question. So the first one, I think food is great. So I'll just say that. But we can certainly overdo food.
Yeah.
And again, I think, you know, ourselves personally, we know what our limits are. Mm-hmm. And, you know, not to get existential again, but food isn't just about nutrition. There's a lot of studies done with food and how it releases these pleasure chemicals in our brain. And so food, if it was just nutrition, we would, you know, all eat the same things. We would have a bland diet, and there wouldn't be a need to have variety or differences in food or flavoring or anything, right? We would just eat for nutrition. So I think food in many ways is one of those, you know, they talk about comfort foods. Food is one of those things that can be kind of a double-edged sword. We can overdo it. Mm-hmm. And I would look at where and how you use food, whether it is to balance yourself emotionally or whether you're using it as a treat. A lot of people indulge in something special like cheesecake to celebrate an event. So I think the balance there really is when most of us know when we overdo it. You know, a whole cheesecake is not going to be good for you. Yeah. It might be in the first few minutes, but then it becomes a little too much. So I think having that balance too, but I think food also is one of these things. Again, not to go back, but we as humans, we create conversation and dialogue around food. That brings us together as well too. And I think many of us really frankly are missing that opportunity of sharing the plate, so to speak. And so some of us, they've talked about, a lot of research now is showing in the first few months of how people overindulged and gained 15 to 20 pounds. And that was simply out of anxiety, you know, of overeating. So there's a balance there as well too. Your second question is equally important. Being a social worker myself, and I'll respond to it in this way: misery loves company. So be very careful of your professional role and title, because if you're anything like myself, friends and family often come to you with, quote unquote, their problems. And so I think it's important to set boundaries and limits on the type of guidance or help that we give others, and to tell people up front, you know, I can be available for you for a little bit of time, but it's important for me to have some time for myself too. And to say that, I think, is okay. And if you have a family member and a friend that really is a good family member and a good friend, they will understand why it's important for you to set these limits, right? So you probably notice for yourself when you start to get into this, what I call a spin cycle, right? Where the person is just, you know, and you're like, well, we just talked about that. Yeah, but I really want your advice. Yeah, but we just talked about, yeah, but that was last week, you know, that kind of a conversation. When you get into the spin cycle, it's time to stop the wash machine, take the clothes out and put it in the dryer. So tell the person, we got to take a little break. I love and enjoy talking to you, but I need a little break so that I can be of help to you, so I can recharge and to be a better help to you. I think that's what's important, setting the boundaries and guidelines to the conversations. And misery loves company.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
I was just writing down when you get into the spin cycle. It's time to that was great.
Yeah.
Well, in the spirit of being respectful of boundaries, it is past 7:30 now, and I want to be really respectful of your time, which you've been so gracious with, going beyond the boundaries of the presentation as well. And we are all so grateful for your kindness and your wisdom and your empathy and your compassion. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. And again, I will be sending out the slides and your contact information, which you've generously shared with us, as well as the recording of this presentation. And I will remind everybody here that this is, again, a product of community participation. And if any of you are interested in offering up a program of your own, or would like to give us some feedback on what else you'd like to see, please send us an email. I'll put the club email address in the chat box. And if you think it would help you to feel more connected by getting involved and attending another event like this, we have a bunch of them coming up, from yoga to a happy hour on Thursday and a creativity meetup on Friday. We have an events calendar on our website that's always being updated, so please check that out as well. We'd love to see you. So until next time, thank you again to Dr. Alenkin for a really wonderful hour. And please, everybody, stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you. Please reach out to me if any of you have questions. Thank you. I appreciate the time. Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Courtney. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Be well. Have a good evening.
You.